sports are really important vehicles for relationships.
We have purpose. We have a why. We bring people together. We connect.
I feel like God is our greatest supporter and our greatest coach.
Welcome to Rabbi on the Sidelines. This is Rabbi Sherman from Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. We are joined by a repeat guest, but not repeat information. This is a friend of JBS. This is a friend and professor of Yeshiva University. This is a friend of Sinai Temple and the author of the new book, Marty Glickman, about the American sports legend and his connection to combating anti-Semitism, both in the 1930s, but even his story is relevant today. Dr. Gurock, it's so great to have you. How have you been?
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure. You're doing such wonderful work, both through this show and also through your work as a rabbi. So I'm very proud. I know you many years, and you're just going from strength to strength. So it's a pleasure and a privilege to be on your show.
So the first book we talked about was Jewish Americans encounter with sports.
Judaism encounter with American sports, yeah.
Exactly. We talked about all the different ways from Greenberg and Koufax and baseball and boxing and the immigrant experience. But now you write this book that is specific to one person, Marty Glickman, who even though I never met, I heard of so much because growing up in Syracuse, New York, he was a legend, not only in the broadcast booth, but as I got to learn more about him, on the track field and on the field for track and field. And so take us back to Marty Glickman, not the broadcaster that we all knew, not the track star, but the kid growing up in New York. And what was his first Jewish experience and what was his American experience? And did they mix?
Well, he was a typical second generation American Jew living in New York City with aspirations to make it in the American world. He came from a somewhat traditional background, although he was not all that observant. And later on in his life, he defined himself as a cultural Jew. He went to James Madison High School, which is 90% Jewish. And he had these aspirations to go to college. And he had one thing going for him more than any other student in the school. He was a great runner, a great football player. In fact, he was so good that schools all over the country were vying for his ability. When he was a senior, he played a game at the Ebbets Field of blessed memory, for those of you who come from New York, and he played against Sid Luckman. They drew 20,000 fans to the game, and the game was broadcast on newsreels around the country. So he was a very famous athlete even before he got to Syracuse University. Why did he go to Syracuse? Very interesting. A group of alumni of a Jewish fraternity thought that if they brought a great Jewish athlete to Syracuse, that would mitigate the growing anti-Semitism in the school. The 1930s was an era, and by the way, this is not a sports book.
Right.
This is a book about American Jewish history, using a very important person as the metaphor for telling the story. But to get back to Syracuse very quickly, he goes to Syracuse, and the hope was that he's such a great ball player that this is going to change the attitude of Syracuse University towards Jews. He does very well at Syracuse, but it doesn't change the attitudes of people towards Jews. He's a Yotzei Menachal. He's an exceptional Jew, and they like him because why do they like him? Because he'll bring great honor to the school as an athlete. But his great hope, which was realized, was to go to the 1936 Olympics in Berlin and to run with the great runners Ralph Metcalf and of course Jesse Owens. And he qualifies for the Olympics, and he gets to Germany, and then the story becomes very, very complicated. And,
so I want to dig into the Syracuse aspect because that really is part of my history. And
right.
With my father being a rabbi in Syracuse near the university for 40 years and us really being connected with the athletic department there. And anytime there was a Jewish athlete, they always ended up in our shul. They always ended up at our Seder table and Rosh Hashanah table. And I imagine if I was living in Syracuse in the 1930s that Marty Glickman would also have that kiruv and the outreach there as well. And Syracuse is not Manhattan. It's not Brooklyn. It's not Los Angeles. It's not a major metropolitan city. And at the same time, this anti-Semitic flavor is going on college campuses at that time. Are there any other
college campuses all over the country, all over the
Right.
country. Right.
So were there any other Marty Glickman types in the sports world that were trying to be recruited to other campuses to combat this anti-Semitism as well?
Yes, there were. By the way, he was one of two boys from Madison. Al Handler was a blocking back, so they recruited a guy to block for Glickman, and Glickman would run with the ball for the football team. So sure, again, there was Sid Luckman goes to Columbia, and Columbia also makes a distinction. They invite him because he's going to improve the football program. So you have people of that sort at other colleges and universities. And by the way, there are some schools that are so anti-Semitic that they don't want Jewish athletes there because they feel they will not fit into the college campus life at all. And there are stories of Jewish athletes who never get off the bench because the school doesn't want a Jew to be high profile as an athlete at the school. It's a very difficult time for Jews in America. And interestingly, Marty Glickman, he skates pretty much through this very, very nicely. You know, he's invited to sit at the training table. Interestingly, there's a story that he relates in one of his, he wrote three autobiographies, that he sat down for a meal and they were serving, he thought they were serving a kosher meal. Okay, turns out it was pork chops. It was the first time he ate pork chops. No one snuck the pork chops at him, right? He wanted to be part of the team. Listen, the big story is sports. Are you chosen in or are you chosen out? Okay, and Marty Glickman, for the early part of his life, always felt that he was part of the group and he was accepted, even though other Jews had great difficulties. So for the first 17 years of his life, he skated right through all these things, and then things would turn for him when he got to Berlin, but not exactly when he got to Berlin.
Let's talk about the path to Berlin. At what point do you realize, like, oh my gosh, I have the ability to serve my country through sports? At what point did he realize, like, I can do this? And at what point did he realize it's not going to happen?
Well, he thinks it's going to happen straight through. Okay. He's on the boat to SS Manhattan. He sits at the captain's table. He sits next to Avery Brundage. Avery Brundage is the head of the American Olympic Committee. He's accepted. He gets to Berlin. He gets to the Olympic Village, and he knows a little bit of Yiddish. He speaks Yiddish to the Nazi guards in the village. He and a guy named Goldberg, who was on the baseball team. Baseball at the Olympics in '36 was simply an exhibition sport. They hitch a ride to the stadium with a Wehrmacht lieutenant who's thrilled to have two American athletes in his car. At the end, he asked for their autograph. So they scribble their names, Goldberg and Glickman, because they're Jews. But they feel that everything's working for them at the stadium. Okay. So he's ready to be in the way the story goes. And, you know, frankly, so many people don't know this story. And I think one of the things I want to do is teach the story is that he's ready to run in one of the signature events in the Olympics, a 4x100 meter relay race. And there are 80,000, there's going to be 80,000 fans in the stands. One of the fans will be Adolf Hitler. Another will be Goebbels. Another will be Goering. Okay. A day before the event, the Olympic coaches come into the room and say, we've heard a rumor. The Germans have been hiding some great runners and we want to win this race. So Marty Glickman, and Sam Stoller, the forgotten other Jew on that 4x100 team, you're out. Metcalf is in and Jesse Owens is in. Jesse Owens stands up and says, I have 3 gold medals. I don't need any more gold medals. Let Glickman run. And they tell Owens, boy, sit down. That's how blacks were treated. That's how athletes were treated back then. And Glickman doesn't get a chance to run. Of course, the whole business about this great German runner ridiculous, and the Americans win maybe by 100 yards, whatever it is. So all of a sudden, Glickman's consciousness is raised by the fact that now he's being seen as a Jew, not just as an American athlete. And what makes it worse is the newspapers, the general newspapers and the Jewish newspapers, the Anglo-Jewish newspapers, they don't make a big deal about it. If anything, they say, Glickman was a stand-up guy. He was taken off the team. He took it well, and he moved on. It's an important story. It tells you a lot about the passivity of American Jews, the feeling that they don't belong, and Glickman feels that for the first time. Last quick story. He comes back to New York. He's an Olympian. He wants to work out at the New York Athletic Club.
Yep.
He comes to the door, and they say, Glickman, you can't come in because you're a Jew. You can't be a member of New York Athletic Club. So here is this social anti-Semitism, which he skated around, hitting him right in the face. And Rabbi Sherman, I got to tell you a family story. My father was a wrestler. He wrestled for the 92nd Street YMHA. He wrestled under an assumed name, Jack Austin. He didn't want his mother to know he was becoming a bum, becoming a wrestler, okay? We had in our home, and I'm sorry we lost it when my parents passed away, we had a stolen towel from the New York Athletic Club. That was because the Jewish Y wrestled against the New York AC, and my father took a towel. That's as close as Jews could get to being in this wasp preserve. So what I've told you is using sports as a metaphor, but it's not about sports. It's about whether you're part of the group or outside the group. And Jews as outsiders in the 1930s, Whitman always said, this is not a Holocaust story. And he was right. It's a prequel to the Holocaust. Jews not being accepted. And that is one of the powerful things that I try to bring across in doing this book, which made the book.
What about the aspect of passivity? You said it was a passive American Jewish audience that was not necessarily into it, but okay, it's whatever. At what point did it become a moment that people understood what this was going to mean? And also, just going back to the Berlin Olympics, I believe in the book you said Hitler was in the stands. Is that correct?
Hitler's in the stands. We have a picture in the book of the Nazi hierarchy in the stands. And there's a movie that came out called Race about Jesse Owens. It annoyed me because they told the story very poorly. Because in the story, they talk about Glickman being in the stands and coming out of the stands. And when Jesse Owens wins his race, when the 4x100 team win the race, he embraces Jesse Owens and he feels that this is a great, and they chant USA, USA, USA. In reality, Glickman was alone. And so were alone up in the stands. This is again a sense of, so what am I saying about American Jews? Today we're living through an era of difficulties for American Jews. But the good news for me is that Jews and African Americans and others are not afraid to speak out, not afraid to join coalitions with good people to fight against anti-Semitism. We're not a frightened group in the 21st century. But from my point of view, in the 1930s, we are a frightened group. And we're afraid how our behaviors will be seen on the American scene. And I think Marty,
I'm going to put back on that for a second, because I actually think, as a sort of next generation American rabbi that did not face this anti-Semitism in the 1980s and even 1990s, the way that we're teaching our children, I actually almost feel the fear again, right? The amount of armed guards that surround our synagogues, the amount of precautions that we take within our synagogues and our services, and then thinking about how we are perceived, actually even on the sports field, is really almost like turning the tables again. Again, not back to the 1930s, but this idea of how we are being seen, I feel like, is coming up again.
Well, you know what? We should respond to anti-Semitism whenever it manifests itself. But the fact of the matter is, in the sports venue, my point of view is we're doing quite well in terms of, I'll give you an example. you mentioned that I happened to teach at Yeshiva University for 48 years. The last few years, we've had a pretty good basketball team. They've gone to the small big dance. Right? Okay, that's Division III dance. They've had some good players. For me, historically speaking, what's so interesting for me is not who's playing in the game. The fact that when Yeshiva plays a game, the opening round, when does it take place? At noon, not at 8 p.m. on Friday night. You know, the NCAA has more rules than the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law. And then they make accommodation for us and for another school that has a Y on its uniform called Brigham Young. They're Mormon. They don't play on their Sabbath. So, is anti-Semitism a problem today? Yes. Should we respond? Yes. All these things are problematic. But at the same time, this is not 1930s where the American Olympic Committee conspires with the Nazis to keep these Jews off the victory stand. And I want to say something else. When I lecture about this book and I mention Avery Brundage, I say in Hebrew, Avery Brundage, Yamach Shemo. Yamach Shemo means we should forget his name. In 1972, Avery Brundage is no longer the head of the American Olympic Committee. What is he, Rabbi Sherman? He's head of the International Olympic Committee. In 1972, 11 Israeli athletes are murdered by Palestinian terrorists. And who's the head of and what does Avery Brundage do? He says, one day of mourning. The games must go on. And I got to tell you something else as I ramble on. On vacation, I read this wonderful biography of Jim Thorpe, written by David Marinas. Did you know in 1912, this Native American won 4 gold medals in the Olympics, and then he lost his gold medals because of allegations that he'd become a professional? And who is involved in that? The young Avery Brundage. So we should identify those who hate us and respond. And this book really takes him to task because, again, they don't want, in this case, they don't want to embarrass Adolf Hitler by having a Jew win a gold medal and stand on that victory stand in front of 80,000 people.
So take us to the postscript of the Munich story with Bob Costas and the Olympics on NBC. And then I want to go back to the Jesse Owens, Marty Glickman aspect of social consciousness of what happens there as well. So Bob Costas, where does he fit?
Bob Costas, very important part of the story. In 2012, the Olympics go back to London. They had been there earlier, okay? And Bob Costas, who was a disciple of Marty Glickman, I have a whole chapter called Marty as Mentor, talking about many of the great sportscasters, whether it's Marv Albert, who's his number 1 disciple, Spencer Ross, Sal Marciano. Anyway, so Bob Costas is anchoring the march into the Olympic Stadium, okay, opening ceremonies. The Israeli national team and the London Jewish community petitioned the International Olympic Committee to memorialize the fact that 40 years earlier, Jews had been murdered in Munich in 1972. As the and the Olympic Committee refused to do it. Mm-hmm. When the American team marched in, when the Israeli team marched in, Bob Costas, bless him, went off script and said, I want everybody to know who these people are and what happened to them 40 years ago. At that point, they went to a commercial. They cut him off, okay? Marty Glickman was dead for 11 years, but I have to think that had he been still alive or somewhere he's listening, okay, he'd be very pleased that one of his guys, Bob Costas, who's a Greek American, a proud American, took the Jewish cause as his own and spoke out at an appropriate moment. So Bob Costas is in the book because of that thing and connected to Marty Glickman.
And so Marty Glickman was sort of in between 2 stories. The Jesse Owens piece of him watching an African-American athlete stand up for him, saying, I have enough gold medals, it's your turn. And then going back, there was a football player, I believe, in Syracuse who Marty Glickman did not stand up for and realized after he was, I believe, killed, saying, I can't believe I didn't stand up for him. Maybe you can share that piece as well.
Sure. So there was a a player on the Syracuse varsity football team when he comes back from Berlin, and Syracuse is playing against the University of Maryland. That's a border state, and this guy, his last name is Singh, S-I-N-G-H. Okay, is a fullback for Syracuse, and they don't let him play because the Maryland newspapers make a point that this black player is playing for Syracuse. And Glickman is in the locker room. He doesn't stand up and say what Jesse Owens had said. And from the memoirs that Glickman had, he was troubled by this for the rest of his life. He always thought about the fact that Owens had stood up for him. It didn't help, right? Speaks about the racism of that time period. And he didn't do it. This black young man ended up being in World War II, and he died as a hero in the war. And Glickman said that he was enough of an American to die for his country, but he couldn't play for his country. One of my teachers once said 50 years ago, he was African American, that for minority groups, wars and sports are community-defining situations. I think, Rabbi, we discussed this years ago when the first book was published. Wars and sports. So if you want to see how American Jews are doing or how African Americans are doing, let's see whether they're allowed to fight for their country or play for their country. And by the way, when Jesse Owens comes back to New York after winning those 4 gold medals, and that 4th gold medal would have been Glickman's, right? There's a ticker tape parade down Fifth Avenue in New York. And afterwards, there's a celebratory dinner at the Waldorf Astoria. Jesse Owens is honored at that dinner, but he has to go up the service elevator. Wars and sports define identity and acceptance or non-acceptance in sports. So when people read this book, they will learn about the great broadcaster, the great, the voice of the Knicks and the voice of the Jets and, of course, the Giants. We all know that. But I hope we can get beyond that story, which is an important story, and see how we can use Glickman's life as a way of understanding the problems, the expectations, the hopes of a whole generation of American Jews. And if I can just mention one other aspect of his anti-Semitism, Glickman's great goal in life, after he comes back from the Olympics, is to be a nationally recognized broadcaster. But he never makes it because he will not change his name from Marty Glickman to Marty Manning. And also, he sounded like me, a New York Jew with my New York dialect, okay? And the moguls who ran the early NBA felt that a guy named Glickman, who sounded like a New Yorker, would not play well in Peoria. And the saddest part about that was the 2 guys, the 2 leaders of this little NBA, which was not very popular at that point, okay? Some players were making maybe $5,000 a year, okay? Were Maurice Podoloff and Haskell Cohen, 2 Jews, who were so afraid of how Jews would play on the American street that they told Marty Glickman, change your name or you're too much of a New York Jew. Your audience should ask themselves, did they ever hear of Esau Danielovich? You know who that is? Kirk Douglas. They all changed their names. Right?
Our preschool, the Douglas Preschool ECC, a very close connection.
So it's part of the American story. Using, again, if I had to look at my career, and thank God I've done 25 books, okay, in my life. The most important thing I've done as a scholar is to raise the study of sports from who are the great champions to the questions of acceptance, rejection, anti-Semitism, racism. You know, Rabbi, that the beginning of the civil rights movement takes place not in 49 when Harry S. Truman desegregates the armed forces, but 47 And we all wear number 42. All the players wear number 42. Jack Roosevelt Robinson, right? All these things are very important in understanding American history.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about combating anti-Semitism. It's now happening the other way through sports, specifically of things like I'm doing. Actually, when I started this podcast a couple of years ago, the first couple of people were Dan Schulman, Seth Greenberg, all Jewish broadcasters who during their broadcasting don't necessarily bring out their Jewish ethos, but when you speak to them on platforms like this, they say absolutely, whether it's playing for Maccabi or Israel or different anti-Semitic things that I remember Seth Greenberg talked about in the locker room of Long Beach when he was coaching there. He had some issues, and then he brought that out. Look at what Robert Kraft's doing right now with the combating anti-Semitism movement. Actually, in a month, I'm going to be speaking in Marquette for a conference called The Power of Sport and Humanity, put on by the Vatican with Doc Rivers and Dal Ackerman of the Commissioner of the Big East. And so it's interesting to see now the sports world actually not being used, but being a platform for combating anti-Semitism, for bringing people together against hate and sort of more love.
I want to embarrass you and connect you to me in another way that is so important. You told me that a while back, not that long ago, you spoke to a group of athletes from USC, University of Southern California, track players. I don't know if there were any women, but track people.
Both of them were women. It was interesting.
There were women who are about to go to Auschwitz on a consciousness-raising tour, okay? And one of the things you did, and it warmed my heart, I got to tell you, it warmed my heart that one of the things you mentioned in your talk as a rabbi was my work on Marty Glickman. And for me, the fact that school in 1936, the track coach was one of the conspirators with Avery Brundage to keep Marty Glickman off the Olympic stage. And now in 2023, these ball players are going to Auschwitz, raising consciousness. So, I like to sell a lot of books, but even if I sell no books, the fact that you used it in this context is so important in raising the people's understanding of what's going on. And also, my core audience of people like of your dad's generation, who's my generation, who knew Marty Glickman. I want people to know who he was. I want him to know what my parents' generation. I mentioned my dad as a wrestler. Before he went to the Navy in 1942, he and Mom went to New Hampshire on a vacation in the height of the off season, and they hadn't taken down the signs: no Jews, dogs, or consumptives around. That's not been my life, but as much as history is very important.
Actually, when I was still with USC, so I want to give credit where credit is due to Dr. Julie Russo, who is the Associate Athletic Director of USC, who, number one, last year I spoke on a panel with other faith leaders about the intersection between sports and faith and how athletes can feel comfortable in their faith backgrounds. And then this was actually through the USC Shoah Foundation. Dr. Julie Russo, also a broadcaster on the Pac-12 network, Olav Shalom for the Pac-12 over the next year. The first thing I asked these young athletes, 18, 19, and 20 years old, split between different races and genders, I said, do you know who Marty Glickman is? And not one person raised their hand, 18, 19, 20 years old. And when I shared the story and explained about the USC coach, who would have been their coach back in the day, if that coach knew that these young people were going to go to Auschwitz with the USC Shoah Foundation, and in February, we are inviting that track team to Sinai Temple when we have our Holocaust survivors brunch, when we bring in survivors to interact with our religious school students as well. And what was interesting in watching before I spoke to them, what they were doing, the Shoah Foundation was training them and asking them this question: how responsible are you or what is your responsibility to tell the stories of others? And most of these track athletes were young African Americans who raised their hands, or most of them were wearing crosses, and they said they have deep faith. They're the first person that's ever gone to college in their family. And they said they understand the responsibility for others to tell their stories, and now they were learning the responsibility to tell the stories of others. And I watched it on Instagram as they were going, and they're making a documentary about this. And another one I think it's really important to understand is Coach Bob McKillop of Davidson, from 2018, took his team to Auschwitz, and now is looking for another major college basketball team to take that trip as well.
I think it's one. I think it's very, very important. And this type of work, using sports as an educational tool. At the end of the day, wins and losses are very transitory, but the larger themes are things that we have to teach. And I have to tell you, not only are 18, 19, and 20-year-old African Americans in California unaware of the Glickman story, but so are kids in my Jewish day schools in New York unaware of Glickman's story. But when I tell them the story, they want to know more. They want to know more, and the context is very, very, very important. How a young man goes out of a Jewish neighborhood, tries to make it in America, all the difficulties, and ultimately succeeds. And has a raft of disciples. One of the joys of this book, if I can say it for a second, was that I got to meet through Zoom and through emails all sorts of great sports figures, announcers, and they all wanted to talk about Marty Glickman. And probably my favorite interview was with Bill Walton, who has some cachet where you are in LA. Yeah. So one of my interviewees says, "Listen, you gotta speak to Bill Walton. He loved Marty Glickman." So I sent an email to Walton, and he gets back to me within an hour. He says, "I'd love to talk to you. It takes a while for us to connect." I said, "Why did you love Marty Glickman?" He said, "Because I stuttered and stammered. I just saw this HBO show about Walton, and he admits to stammering. And Glickman, who stammered as a kid, helped him." He says, "This was the most important person in my life." I said, "What about John Wooden?" He said, "John Wooden was great. He was a great coach." So when Glickman died, they interviewed John Wooden about Marty Glickman. And they asked him, "What do you think about Marty Glickman?" He said, "He was okay. He was a good guy. That's all." And he had a great line. He said, "He taught Bill Walton to speak, and now Walton never shuts up." Okay? Yeah. But that's a great sense of humor, greatest coach of our generation, and a deeply religious person, by the way. And Bill Walton said, "Well, Marty Glickman was so important to me." So it's just been so much fun doing this book.
So at the end of the book, as you mentioned, that some things really stayed with Glickman a long time. He really didn't bring up this episode of his life in the Olympics until much later in his life. And then you have this scene at the end of the book where I believe his children, after he passed, go back to Germany. Take us to that moment and Glickman's legacy in his own family. What does that look like today?
So 1985, Marty Glickman goes back to Berlin as part of a documentary about Jesse Owens. And he walks into the stadium which he was, sidelined. And he has this consciousness raised. I'm here, I'm back, and they're all dead. But more importantly, it's during an era where American Jews are finally talking very strongly about what happened to our people in the 1940s. Okay, and he hooks up with the U.S. Holocaust Museum and travels the country talking about his experiences about anti-Semitism, when he calls the prequel to the Holocaust. And at the end of his life, after he dies, his children go back to Berlin. They're invited back by the first Maccabiah Games. They're held in Germany after World War II. Nancy Glickman is invited back to represent the family. And she comes to the stadium and she has this moment. She yells out, "Dad, we're here, we're back," And it's such an important moment for the family. And they say this is something our family should memorialize and remember. So this is, again, Marty wasn't around anymore, but I think this is a very, very important moment for the family. And we're all part of his family in that respect. I never got to meet, by the way, Marty Glickman, but I almost did. A few weeks before he died, the American Jewish Historical Society were going to honor him. And I was chairman of the academic council of the AJHS. And they knew I was their sports guy. I was their jock. So they said, "Gurock, you'll interview Marty Glickman." I loved Marty Glickman. I listened to him on my radio as a kid. And sadly, Marty Glickman didn't show up. He was still ill, and then he died soon thereafter. So I closed the book by saying that I never met Marty Glickman, but I think, this is not a celebratory book. It's a serious book. Mm-hmm. But I think that in some respects, at least I hope, I did justice to his life and to his memory. and I hope people will become intrigued with Marty's story. It's a very basic American Jewish story through the metaphor of sports.
It's actually interesting because we're recording this right during the time of the U.S. Open, and I just read an article this morning that there was incident with the German tennis player yesterday. I don't remember his name, but somebody in the fans shouted he's not Jewish, but a pro-Nazi slogan to him, and he asked the umpire to please remove this person from the stands. And so it's sort of the reverse. Now here in America, a German who said that I'm not proud of the history of the Nazi past, but now this person's associating with me. And so these themes keep sort of weaving in and out of the sports world. And so what's your advice as we close to the next generation of athletes, of broadcasters, of fans, in how this sports world can help heal the world in a little better way?
You know what? I'll quote Sal Marciano, who's not a Jew, okay? Who was pressured to change his name and he didn't change his name. And he said, years later, he ran to Frank Sinatra, who said, I'm so proud of you because you didn't give up your heritage. Okay? So I think the message, it's important to fight anti-Semitism, but it's important to have pride in your heritage and maintain your identity, whether you're a Jew or Italian, whatever it might be. That, by the way, that's the most powerful antidote to anti-Semitism. Be proud of your people, fight when it counts, but also identify strongly with your faith, with your traditions. It's not a Jewish story. It has to be an American story. Just ask the people at Brigham Young about the fact that the NCAA accommodated them. I guess that's my message as far as the future is concerned. We can't predict the future. What we can do is be proud of our heritage and teach it to our children, the good, the bad, and also sometimes the ugly. That's all part of our story.
Dr. Jeff Gurock, it's always great to have you. If you can hold up that book, the reason I don't have a copy is because I actually gave it away to the USC track team. It's Marty Glickman, authored by Jeff Gurock, The Life of an American Jewish Sports Legend. It's coming out in early October, and we look forward to more conversations. When I speak with you, I always learn a lot, not just about sports, but about Judaism, about American history, and really what it means to live in this world as an active participant in the Jewish story as well. It's great to see you, and have a see you soon.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.